Welcome to today's webinar on harnessing resilience. I'm Dr. Rebecca Johansson. Just in case you haven't had a chance to glance over my bio, my background is actually in theater. I have a PhD in theater, and I'm coming to you today from the United States, if you can't tell by my accent. And so my background, though, led me into starting to develop programs around emotional intelligence around a little over 10 years ago. And I regularly lead programs around emotional intelligence, collaboration, creativity, storytelling, and looking at unconscious bias. And today I thought we would do a deep dive into harnessing resilience because massive global changes in the last few months have led this to be the #1 requested topic that I've been working with my own personal clients. So today we are going to dive into looking at, first of all, creating a definition for what is resilience, so that we all understand what it is that we're talking about when we mention the word resilience. We're going to talk about developing some personal resilience strategies for our own individual responses to times of extreme change. I like to start with this because I think that in order for you to navigate changing times and building resilience with your teams and within your organizations, it has to start with you. It has to start with your own personal emotional responses to change. As much as we like to say that we don't experience emotions in the workplace, we can't not feel. So we need to acknowledge that those feelings happen, particularly in turbulent times and times of rapid change. And we need to be able to learn how to navigate those emotional responses and get to a more objective space so that when we start to look at our teams and our organizations and how we're dealing collectively with issues that arise, we are coming at it from a better space personally. So I want to start us off with a poll right away this afternoon. We're going to be taking a look at personal and team and organizational resilience. So I just want you to post in the poll, which aspect of resilience are you hoping to develop the most today? Are you looking at your own personal resilience? Is it just within your team, within the organization that you're looking at, or is it the whole organization? Or is it all of the above? That'll just help give me a little bit of idea of where the focus should spend today, if we're going to spend the bulk of our time in one section or another. And starting to see some polls coming in, looking really high on the personal resilience side. A lot of people saying all of the above. Great, we'll just give it another little bit to finish up. And Robin, you can tell me when we get to a good number of people responding. Fantastic. Okay, personal resilience and team resilience and all of the above seem to be the largest areas of interest today. So we will spend a good amount of time doing a deep dive into that. That lets me know that that's where we should spend most of our energy today. And I'm hoping that you will walk away today with some really solid concrete strategies for how to do that. Okay, great. And we can go ahead and move on. Fantastic. So just a little bit of some resources that you can do a deeper dive into on your own. I do also have these listed at the end, but just to know where I'm going to be drawing some of the information from today. On the more personal resilience side is the book, The Resilience Breakthrough by Christian Moore. If anybody attended the IDD webinar I did a few years ago on the topic, that's where most of the focus came from. Also, Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong, is a fantastic resource for looking at your own personal resilience. For more team and organizational resilience, the Harvard Business Review has a wonderful collection of essays on resilience under the subtopic of emotional intelligence that offer a little bit more of an insight into organizational and team resilience. And then the book, Resilience, Why Things Bounce Back, is a fantastic resource for looking at bigger picture systemic and organizational resilience strategies. Okay, so let's dive into our definition of resilience. Resilience is, according to Christian Moore, the ability to bounce back after you have every reason to shut down. Resilient people have both tapped and untapped reserves, enabling them to overcome and thrive as they face setbacks, challenges, and the fears of daily life. So it's learning how to come back from the most intense moments of adversity that you face in your life. What motivates you to bounce back up is what Christian Moore looks at in his book. What kind of resilient strategies can we develop that will motivate us to pick ourselves back up once we've been experienced adversity. The book Resilience, Why Things Bounce Back, takes a look at resilience as critically rooted in our habits of mind, habits that we can cultivate and change. I like to think of resilience as a subtopic of emotional intelligence. It's one aspect of emotional intelligence. And the psychologist Howard Gardner famously many years ago proposed the theory of multiple intelligences, that in addition to our IQ, our actual intelligence in terms of being able to understand information, that gets set in fairly early in our lives. About 8 or 9 years old is when our IQ gets set, and we can't really grow it very much beyond that. We can accumulate more information, but our ability to learn intellectually caps out at your IQ number isn't going to expand very much beyond around age 8 or 9. Our emotional intelligence, however, is something that we can constantly be growing and developing. And we can develop that through developing new habits. We formulate what are called associative barriers in our brain. They're grooves that dive into our brain that give us new pieces of information that we can rely on instantly. Like, the thing that I am sitting in is a chair. And I know that because that has been reinforced in my brain over many, many years of experiencing chair. So when I feel the need to sit down, I don't have to process what's an object that I can sit on. I can sit on this chair. Similarly, our emotional intelligence and our resilience are habits that we can form, grooves that we can form in our mind through repetition, through making a habit out of it, through making it a practice. So some of the techniques that I'm going to be talking about today may feel very uncomfortable and very formulaic when you first start to adapt them into your everyday lives, but the more often you do them, the more they become a part of your natural response. Okay. I like to start off with our personal resilience strategies because we're going to be looking at Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong, and diving deep into one aspect of it. And Brene Brown says we can't chart a brave new course until we recognize exactly where we are, get curious about how we got there, and then decide where we want to go. Now, this quote comes from a visit that she made to Pixar Studios here in the US. Pixar does a lot of the major animated films, and for a solid point of reference today, I'm going to be talking about the movie Toy Story. I just looked at the word pole and I said Pole Story, Toy Story, which I hope most of you will be familiar with. And what she discovered when she went to Pixar Studios and she visited and she saw the area of the studio where they developed their scripts and they developed their stories. She saw Post-it notes that posted out the strategy that people like me with a PhD in theater are very familiar with, and that is the 3-act structure for telling a story. And that 3-act structure is in Act 1, in the very beginning, is when we have some sort of conflict or some sort of instigating incident happen. There is no drama without conflict. There is no life without conflict. Conflict is inevitable, and it's how we navigate those challenges that define who we become as people. So in Act 1, there's always some moment that tests the hero's sense of understanding about who they are in the world. And then Act 2 is where we have the rising action, where the protagonist is tested in some way. And then finally in Act 3, they've overcome whatever that obstacle is, whatever that conflict is, and then there's a resolution and there's a happy ending. And Brene Brown had an epiphany when she saw that structure laid out at Pixar Studios, that you cannot skip Act 2. Act 2 is the most uncomfortable part of this process, but it's where the most action happens in a story. So for example, in Toy Story, in Act 1, Woody has the instigating incident. The conflict is the arrival of a new toy with Buzz Lightyear. And that throws Woody's understanding of his place in the world into chaos. And the bulk of the film is centered around the struggle over redefining who he is in this new world and integrating Buzz into his life as one of his closest friends rather than as an enemy. And then the resolution and the happy ending is that they all find a way to live together at the end. But the bulk of the film happens in Act Two. And human beings like to try to skip over that and jump straight to the happy ending once something has happened that challenges who we are. And what we want to do is figure out a strategy for how are we going to work through Act Two so that we can arrive to that happy ending at the end of Act Three. We love to jump to problem solving. It's in our nature. Something happens and we need to immediately solve it. But unless we spend that time in Act Two really trying to figure out what's going on and what's triggering our responses to it, then we might be trying to solve the wrong problem. Or we might not be aware of all of the possibilities that are at our disposal to have that resolution if we're still stuck in our very subjective, very emotionally triggered response to change. So there's a process for going through this. In Act One, we need to try to start engaging with our feelings, getting curious about the story behind those feelings. When we experience an emotion, we have a visceral physical reaction to it, and that's our first clue that we are experiencing something. Again, in the workplace, we like to think that we don't experience emotions, that we don't have emotions, that emotions don't belong there. But our first step toward overcoming adversity is to acknowledge that those emotional responses are very real, they exist, and starting to get curious about why we've responded the way that we have. So we need to get curious, but choosing to get curious means choosing to be vulnerable, and that requires a surrender to uncertainty. And none of us feel very comfortable with that, because getting curious and acknowledging that we are vulnerable in some way is acknowledging that there's a gap in our knowledge in some way. Being vulnerable can be incredibly challenging for people. And if anybody's read Brene Brown's work, she does a lot of work around the idea of vulnerability and the kind of growth that can happen when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Because curiosity, getting curious about those emotions, is connected to our creativity, to our intelligence, to our improved learning and memory, and to our problem solving. So unless we start to get curious and we start to really ask ourselves the hard questions about what's happening with us, we're not going to get to that Act Three. We're not going to get to that ability to effectively problem solve and have the happy ending. So in Act One, some of the questions you can ask yourself: why am I being so hard on everyone around me today? How did I get to the point where I want to punch a wall? I'm having a very strong emotional reaction. What is going on underneath that? I know that Oreos, French fries, Oreos might be a very American reference, wine won't solve the problem. So what's really happening? What's going on with my body? Why is my stomach in knots today? So just asking yourself that question, why? I'm aware that this is happening, and now I need to get curious and find out, why is this happening? Then we have to do the hard work of getting into Act Two, which is where we have to get honest with ourselves about the stories that we make up about our struggles. And whenever we face adversity, we all like to make up stories about what happened to make ourselves the hero. We like to be the center of our own story, and we like to think that we have done nothing wrong, that everything has happened to us. But we have very much played a part in how everything has unfolded, and we need to acknowledge our place within that story. We need to acknowledge how we've been telling ourselves a story that makes us the hero. So we need to get honest with what really happened versus what we like to say happened. And Brene Brown recommends that we do that through writing. I can give you a couple of other tips for how to process that when we're finished with this section, but I want to focus on her process of writing. And she recommends that we write what she terms an SFD, and the G-rated version of what that stands for is the stormy first draft. She's from Texas, so she uses a slightly different word to stand in for the S there, but I won't say that today. And she recommends writing out what is that first draft, what is that story that I've been telling myself, and she wants you to frame it as the story I'm telling myself is. So that way you can get honest with yourself, but at the same time acknowledge this is the story that I'm saying to be able to help myself cope with what's happening. It's not permission to be hurtful. It's not permission to put blame entirely on the other person in the situation or on the world, whatever the antagonist is to your protagonist. But we do know that writing for 15 to 20 minutes a day for 4 consecutive days can decrease our anxiety, rumination, depressive symptoms, and increase our immune systems. There was a study that was done several years ago here in the US with a factory that had shut down in a rural town, and a large number of all of the employees were let go. And the psychologist went into the factory and said, asked to do a psychological study with the people who had been let go from the organization. And they put them into 3 different groups. The first group was asked to come into this job center that they had set up on site, and they asked them to spend 30 minutes writing about their feelings and writing about processing what had happened to them. And then the other 30 minutes of the hour that they spent was spent building their CV, looking for jobs, the usual pieces that are related to searching for a new job. The second group came in and were told only for the hour to work on writing their CV, work on looking for new jobs. And then the third group was a control group that was just told to sit around for an hour and wasn't given any particular direction of anything to do. What they found was that the first group that processed their feelings overwhelmingly were rehired within the first 6 months. I think something around 57% of them were rehired within the first 6 months, and something like 75% were within a year had a new job. The other groups were far less successful with finding a new job. And that they theorized that that was because by processing the emotions, they worked their way through it and they let it go. And if any of you have ever been on a job interview, you know that oftentimes the question that gets asked is, please tell us about your previous employer. And if you're still harboring negative emotional responses to your previous employer, whether you say the right thing or not, that's going to unconsciously come out in your nonverbals. And so the job seekers that they worked with that had been able to process those emotional responses were much more objective about what had happened and were able to let go. So we know that writing can help you work through that process. So in Act 2, some of the questions you want to ask once you've written that SFD, that stormy first draft, are what more do I need to understand about the situation? What do I know objectively? What assumptions am I making? We'll talk about that more in just a moment. What more do I need to learn and understand about the other people in the story? What additional information do I need? What questions or clarifications might help? We like to make other people the enemy in the story. And sometimes getting to know a little bit more about where they're coming from and putting ourselves in their shoes can help us to identify where the conflict arose. What more do I need to learn and understand about myself? What's happening that's underneath my responses? What am I really feeling? What part did I play? Oftentimes, if we experience anger, there's really another different emotion underlying that. And it's usually sadness or fear. Usually fear, anxiety leads us to lash out and experience anger, especially toward other people's actions when they impact us. So asking yourself, what more do I need to learn and understand about my responses as well as them, as well as the situation? Now, I want to introduce you to the idea of the ladder of inference that can help us think about how we can get more objective about asking those kinds of questions. So in the ladder of inference, there is at the very bottom rung of the ladder, the world of observable external data. That is all of the information that is available to me to observe. Then I filter out what data I want to focus on based on what I believe. Then I start to add meaning to that data that I filtered out. Then I start to make assumptions based on those meanings, based on that data. Then I update my beliefs about the world and I go back down and I look for more pieces of information that support the assumptions that I have started to make. And at the very top of the ladder, the worst part is taking action based on those beliefs. What we want to do is get back down to the world of observable external data in order to get more objective about our responses to our situations and to the other people involved in those situations. A wonderful example of this in action is Stephen Covey, who authored the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, shares a story where he's on the subway in New York City, and there's a father who is completely emotionally, he's just checked out. He's not paying any attention to, I think, 4 kids that he's got on the train with him that are just running wild around the train and acting out and annoying all of the other passengers. And all of the passengers on the train are getting increasingly agitated with the children's behavior, but the father's not paying any attention to them at all or disciplining them in any way. And Stephen Covey finally got his attention and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind paying attention to what your children are doing?" And the father looked up and had an awareness that what was going on around him and said, "I am so sorry. Their mother just died, and we've just left the hospital, and I am at a loss. I have no idea what to do." And that piece of information immediately shifted everyone's point of view on the train, and everyone rallied together to help him in that moment. And the lesson that gets drawn away from that, that he takes away from that, is that you never have all of the information. You never know what's really going on with somebody that's triggering their emotional responses. So the best way to put yourself in that more objective space about just observing what they're doing and picking up more pieces of information is to ask yourself the simple question, what else could be the reason for their behavior? What else could be the reason for what's happening right now? And it doesn't matter whether the answer to that question is correct or not. By asking the question, you help to bring yourself back down to the bottom rung of that ladder and get more objective. The goal here is, one, definitely to acknowledge that we have emotional responses, but to not let those emotions hijack us from being able to move forward. And the only way to do that is to get more objective. And the best way to get more objective is to bring ourselves back down that ladder, ask ourselves, what else could be the reason for this? What else could be happening? And then that helps us to be more observant about all of the pieces of information around us, rather than focusing in on those few pieces of information that support our worldview. So finally, in Act 3, Brene Brown talks about that as the tumultuous, groundbreaking, no turning back transformation that happens when you practice engaging in the world in this process. And she doesn't really elaborate too much beyond that, because Act 3 is very short in films. It's the happy ending. It's the resolution. It's the positive outcome in movies like Toy Story. So really, we have to spend the bulk of our time there in Act 2, wrestling with our stories for a while and understanding what's happening underneath our emotional responses and getting to a more objective place. Otherwise, we might be trying to solve for the wrong problem, or we might be blind to all of the solutions that might be at our disposal, or we might be having a strong emotional reaction to somebody else that's involved in the situation, and we're not looking at them as a potential ally because we're caught up in our own assumptions that we're making about where they're coming from. So when you need to bounce back from any kind of adversity, you need to be able to tap into all of the resources at your disposal. And the best way to do that is to get to a more objective space. Okay. So in the chat box, I'd love for you guys, as we transition into the next section to look at team and organizational resilience, to talk about which strategy that I just spoke about is going to have the most impact immediately. Is that getting honest with yourself about your feelings or about your situation? Writing or having some kind of process to get through the emotions, or the ladder of inference? So I'll give you just a moment to write out your responses. And while I'm waiting for you guys to write out those responses, I'll give you a couple of other pieces of how you might be able to process other than writing. I work with a number of people who are art psychotherapists who very much believe in art, creating art as a way of processing what's happening underneath your emotional response. responses. And I really do like that, even if you're not artistically inclined, that it's making both the left brain and the right brain work at the same time. So it's looking at a very logical understanding of what's going on by talking about what's happening with you, but then it's allowing that unconscious mind to come out and develop. Also movement, practicing some sort of exercise is a way that a lot of people process their emotions. Movement therapy is a whole field in itself, and just talking out loud to another person to help you process emotions. Hopefully somebody who can be very objective and offer you some constructive feedback that you'll listen to, that you'll actually listen to. So that's been a minute or so now. So Robin, do we have any overwhelming responses here in the chat box?
I'm just having them up now. At the moment, the ladder of inference is coming up top, but it's very small in between all of them, to be honest.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, there's, again, we're doing a very brief introduction to this concept. There's many ways that you can dive in and go through this process a lot more in depth. When I do a full several hour-long program around this, I actually give you an opportunity to go through that whole process and do some practice around it. But we don't have time for that today. So we will move on to talking about resilience in our teams and in our organizations. And there are 3 top tips that I want to give you guys that that work both on a team level and on an organizational level. You can do these on the micro level of your teams, and then on the macro level at your organization if you have the power to make these recommendations to your organization. The first is to anticipate that change is going to happen. I mentioned this in the personal resilience piece, that adversity is inevitable, that conflict is inevitable in our lives. So we need to be able to anticipate that that's going to happen and build that into creating a strategy for how we're going to respond. We need to think about cultivating more diversity of thought, diversity of experience on our teams. The more diverse our team, the more we'll be able to start to anticipate change and problems that might arise. And then find a way to build trust so that people, if you do bring on diverse voices into your teams, they know that their voices are going to be heard and that they're going to be respected. So I'll go into detail in each of these areas. And I want to give you an example, 2 case studies of organizations that did and did not anticipate change very well. The first is Kodak, which is a very famous film company. They processed that thing that we don't use anymore, film. And the reason why I laugh about that, because that's the way they did not anticipate change. There's a very famous study that, or a very famous story that Kodak actually developed digital photographic technology in the 1970s. And they saw this technology as a death sentence to their business model and put it on a shelf and hid it, rather than taking a look at it and seeing it as the future and embracing it and becoming the leader in that kind of technology. So, so the fact that we do not really recognize them as a brand that we use in our everyday lives anymore shows that they did not do very well with anticipating change and anticipating something radically changing in their industry. And instead of being the leader on it, they fell far behind. The other organization is Morgan Stanley, the finance company that was their primary headquarters were in the World Trade Center in New York City. And when the first bombing happened in the 1990s of the World Trade Center, Morgan Stanley recognized that their facility there at the World Trade Center was a target. And they leaned into understanding that that could be a potential threat for the future. And they brought in a number of people to help train their staff at that location on how to rapidly evacuate the building should they need to. And then they spent a lot of money setting up off-site facilities in order to be able to resume work if anything did happen to that central location at the World Trade Center. And as a result, on September 11th, even though they occupied, they had several hundred employees in the World Trade Center. It's been a little while since I've looked at the story to know the exact numbers. They had several hundred people that worked there on multiple floors, and they only lost 7 employees. and they were only shut down for about a day before they were able to set back up at their offsite facilities and resume work. And as tragic as that is, and in fact, one of the 7 employees that they did lose that day was the person who had trained them to evacuate the building, because he stayed behind and made sure that every single employee got out. Even though it cost them a lot of money in the short term, it saved their business in the long term, and more importantly, it saved their employees' lives in the long term. So I always like to think about anticipating what's the worst possible thing that can happen. And in this moment right now, we've experienced one of the worst possible things that can happen. So it's already happened. How can we think about how we can lean back? I always talk about leaning back onto your company's vision and mission statements for an inspiration for figuring out how to move forward. And if your organization doesn't have a really strong mission or vision statement, then now might be a good time to start to take a look at that. Okay, so in terms of cultivating diversity, we want to think about building teams that have a variety of skill sets represented. Want to make sure that everyone on the team talks and listens in roughly equal measure, keeping contributions short and sweet. Members on the team should face each other when they're having a meeting, and their conversation and gestures, I'll tell you where this comes from, need to be energetic. Members connect directly with one another, not just with the team leader. And members carry on back channel or side conversations within the team so that it's not all enclosed within the team meetings. And then members can periodically break, go exploring outside the team, and bring information back. Now, this information comes from a study that was done at the MIT Human Dynamics Lab, where they put badges on employees in several organizations. I think in some over 200 organizations they did this, where they took a look at their energy, their engagement, and their exploration in how they interacted with one another. And this is a model of an unsuccessful team that you're taking a look at right here. And this is where in terms of energy, of the gestures and the nonverbal communication, it's coming from relatively few team members, all directed at or coming from the leader of the team. You can see there in that first diagram under energy that very few team members are actually contributing energetically to the conversation in the team meeting. And then in terms of engagement of who's talking to whom, we can see who the team leader is and who maybe the second in command is on this team. Very little interaction happening with employees D, E, F, H, and I on that team. So there's not very much encouragement for minority voices to be heard on the team. And then in terms of exploration of how often they go outside of the team to take a look and interact with other teams within the organization, that was also very limited. So this is a model of a non-successful team, a team that limits their interaction to a very few people on the team feel confidence to be able to come up and speak, that it's very much centered around the team leader or leaders, and that there's very little conversation that's happening with other teams outside of the immediate team. So that's why we want to think about going back to this previous slide. This is the model that MIT came up with for a successful diverse team. And it's mostly where minority voices feel like they can contribute and that their contributions are welcome. So it's not enough just to hire for diversity. You also have to make people from diverse backgrounds, experiences, and points of view and knowledge bases to be able to feel confident contributing. And how you do that is by building trust. Because when trust exists, we trust that our peer intentions are good, that there's no need to be protective or careful around the group, because that allows us to be vulnerable. And we've talked about the importance of vulnerability. That vulnerability is that space where we can really start to be creative and problem solve effectively, when we can feel comfortable being vulnerable. And we trust that our vulnerabilities won't be used against us, so that we can focus entirely on the job at hand. When we're worrying about what one person or another thinks, or how we're going to be understood on a team, or whether or not we're going to be heard, then that's operating working memory in our brains, and that's not directed on solving the problem. So we need to work on building trust so that everybody feels comfortable being vulnerable in the group and taking risks. When trust is absent, we tend to conceal our weaknesses and our mistakes. We hesitate to ask for help or constructive feedback. And we tend to, again, jump up that ladder of inference about drawing conclusions about the intentions of others without attempting to clarify them. So some of the ways that we can build trust. Building in time in our team meetings to ask for ideas, suggestions, and feedback. Don't just say we want to make everybody's voices feel welcome. Have a structured way that you do that. I worked with an arts organization in New York City where they started implementing regularly letting different team members lead the team meeting. So that way there was a variety of voices being heard. There was a variety of important topics being raised so that every week a new member of the team was able to lead the team in a conversation about the areas that they felt were necessary for exploration. Doing kinds of autobiographical sharing, talking about our hobbies, our tastes, our preferences, our background. The best way to get more objective about people's motivations is to get to know more information about them. So the more we find out about who people are outside of work, the easier it is for us to feel empathy for them, to put ourselves in their shoes, to be more objective about understanding why they're responding the way that they are to things. When I work with groups, I ask them to go around and we time for 30 seconds. Each person in a circle shares something about themselves for 30 seconds that the rest of the team didn't know. And that helps open up some conversation. People start to see some commonalities and interests. People start to see each other as human beings rather than coworkers. And then another strategy that I like to talk about is emptying the cup. Whenever we have a team meeting, especially now when we're doing virtual meetings in this time, we're coming to those meetings with all kinds of other things on our mind. We are already full. And it's really hard to take in more, especially when the kids are running around and needing to log on to get to their virtual classrooms. Partners are demanding things of us. We're trying to deal with the chaos that's around us. We may have full cups. And we need to, in order to be focused and present on what's happening right in front of us, we need to empty that. We need to find a way to let go of everything. But in a team meeting, if you ask everybody to go around and share how they're feeling and what's going on with them today, they're either not going to say anything or they're going to share too much and it's going to become a therapy session for the whole team. And we don't want that. We actually want work to get done. So one of the strategies I like to use is the challenges successes. I ask everybody just to do a very quick check-in and I ask them to tell me what was your greatest success this week? What was the thing that we can cheer you on and give you positive, support for accomplishing? And then what's the biggest challenge that you're facing this week? And that really helps them to celebrate something positive, because positive emotions can be incredibly powerful. But also it gives them an opportunity to really focus on what's the thing that I'm really struggling with this week. And then that helps them to focus their energy for the meeting and for the week ahead, for the work that they're going to be doing. So that's one way that you can empty the cup. If you're going to let people share their feelings about things, do it in a structured way so that it doesn't become a great big therapy session and no work gets done for everybody. Okay, so that's wrapping up our section on team and organizational resilience. Again, going to give you a chance to put in the chat box what strategy will have the greatest impact for your team or organization right now. So using your organizational, can't read my own slide, to navigate change, cultivating an environment for diverse voices, or building trust. So I'll give you a moment to put in the chat box. And Robin, you can let me know when people have started to respond.
They're responding. Trust building is coming up.
Fantastic.
On this one, but we're getting a good mix.
Great.
From people.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, these all work in harmony with each other as well. So yes, you can probably take one piece of this away and start implementing it immediately, but they work hand in hand with one another. So these are things that you can think about building over the long term. Obviously, cultivating more diverse voices is something that is a longer term strategy for some organizations. Some organizations have been doing it for a very long time. But if you're cultivating that diversity, but you're not creating an environment where diverse voices feel heard, then you might have a blind spot that you're not aware of that won't help you to navigate that worst case scenario, or might lead to that worst case scenario happening because you didn't invite diverse voices and make them feel trusted and welcomed to speak up. Okay, so I just want to wrap up with a few takeaways from today, and then I'll open it up for some questions. The first thing is that radically accept the reality of the situation. Get curious about what's happening to your emotional responses there and accept the truth of it. Acknowledge that you have feelings around it, and then you have to find a structured way to process those feelings. It's okay to have those. When this pandemic hit, a lot of us had some very strong emotional reactions, and finding our way out of that and focusing on all the things that we needed to, we may have skipped over processing those emotions, but it's never too late to take the time to go back in and write out, what is the story that I'm telling myself? Don't try to solve your problems until you've worked through your feelings and are in a more objective space. Yes, feelings, emotions happen. They're inevitable. We're not human without them. But we're not going to be effective problem solvers if we give in to those emotions and respond immediately or react immediately from that emotional space. So whatever process works best for you to get more objective, work through that process before you try to solve the problem. Acknowledge the adversity on your team or in your organization. Change is inevitable, and the best, most successful organizations navigate that change because they anticipate that it's going to happen, and they have a plan in place for how to deal with it. And have, as I mentioned, have a clear mission and a vision to guide you forward. That works, I think, both organizationally and individually. If you, during the processing of the emotional responses, take a look at, what is it that I value? What is it that I want? How might I use this as an opportunity to reassess what that is, or to motivate myself to move forward based on the things that I value? And then create an atmosphere of trust and value diversity within your organizations. So those are my biggest takeaways. Again, we've gone through very quickly a lot of strategies that when I do a 2 to 4 or 6 hour program with organizations, we do a deep dive into these and do some practical work about how do we actually put those into practice. I want to leave you with this quote too. Maya Angelou said, "You may not control all of the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them."